Then the motor was much too heavy. So again, they had some original work to do, and they had had no experience building engines. In time to come, the brothers would be widely portrayed as a couple of clever hometown bicycle mechanics who managed, for so many others have failed, of their good old-fashioned American knack for solving seemingly impossible mechanical problems. This was true only in part. For Charlie Taylor, however, the description applied almost perfectly, except that he was more than a clever mechanic, he was a brilliant mechanic, and for the brothers, a godsend. If Sister Catherine found Charlie's claim to know all the answers unbearable, Wilbur and Orville never lost sight of his ability and enormous value to their efforts. And he himself well understood how far beyond him they were in so many ways. As he later said, boasting about them, those two sure knew their physics. I guess that's why they always knew what they were doing and hardly ever guessed at anything. As for building the engine, while the boys were handy with tools, they had never done much machine work. And anyway, they were busy on the airframe. It was up to me. We didn't make any drawings. One of us would sketch out the part we were talking about on a piece of scratch paper, and I'd spike the sketch over my bench. His only prior experience with a gasoline engine had been trying to repair one in an automobile a few years before. But that January, working in the back shop with the same metal lathe and drill press used for building bicycles, he went to work and 6 weeks later had it finished. The motor had 4 cylinders with a 4-inch bore and a 4-inch stroke. It was intended to deliver 8 horsepower and weigh no more than 200 pounds, carry a total of 675 pounds, the estimated combined weight of the flying machine and an operator. As it turned out, the motor Charlie built weighed only 152 pounds, for the reason that the engine block was of cast aluminum, provided by the up-and-coming Aluminum Company of America, based in Pittsburgh. Other materials came from Dayton manufacturers and suppliers, but the work of boring out the aluminum for the independent cylinders and making the cast iron piston rings was all done by one man with a drooping walrus mustache working in the back room at the bicycle shop. The fuel system was simple, he would later explain. A 1-gallon fuel tank was suspended from a wing strut and the gasoline fed by gravity down a tube to the engine. There was no carburetor. Fuel was fed into a shallow chamber in the manifold. Raw gas blended with air in this chamber, which was next to the cylinders, and heated up rather quickly, thus helping to vaporize the mixture. The engine was started by priming each cylinder with a few drops of raw gas. Compared to later engines, all was amazingly simple and crude. The ignition was of the make and break type, in Charlie's expression, probably meaning that if broken, it could be quickly fixed. There were no spark plugs. The spark was made, Charlie explained, by the opening and closing of 2 contact points inside the combustion chamber. These were operated by shafts and cams geared to the main camshaft. The ignition switch was an ordinary single-throw knife switch we bought at a hardware store. The little gas motor, as Bishop Wright called it, was finished by mid-February, and when started up in the shop the first time, the racket, clouds of smoke were nearly unbearable. When further tested the next day, the engine block cracked. Dripping gasoline had frozen the bearings, breaking the engine body and frame. Another 2 months went by before a second block would be delivered from Pittsburgh. This engine worked fine, and as a bonus, delivered an unexpected 12 horsepower. Meantime, the design of the propellers had become a still bigger challenge. I think the hardest job Will and Orv had was with the propellers, Charlie later said. I don't believe they ever were given enough credit for that development. The problem became more complex the more the brothers studied it. Much to their surprise, they could find no existing data on air propellers. They had assumed they could go by whatever rule of thumb marine engineers used for the propellers on boats, and accordingly drew on the resources of the Dayton Library, only to find that after 100 years in use, the exact action of the screw propeller was still obscure. Once more, they were left no choice but to solve the problem themselves. Our minds, said Orville, became so obsessed with it that we could do little other work. They began to see the propeller as an airplane wing traveling in a spiral course, and that if they could calculate the effect of a wing traveling a straight course, why could they not calculate the effect of one traveling in a spiral course? But on further consideration, Orville would explain, it is hard to find even a point from which to make a start, for nothing about a propeller or the medium in which it acts stands still for a moment. The thrust depends upon the speed and the angle at which the blade strikes the air. The angle at which the blade strikes the air depends on the speed at which the propeller is turning, the speed the machine is traveling forward, and the speed at which the air is slipping backward. The slip of the air backwards depends on the thrust exerted by the propeller and the amount of air acted upon. When any one of these change, it changes all the rest, as they are all interdependent on one another. After several months of study and discussion, they had come to understand that the thrust generated by a standing propeller was no indication of the thrust when in motion, and that the only realistic way to test the efficiency of a propeller would be to try it out on the flying machine. During these months, their discussions became as intense as they had ever been. Heated words flew, filling hours of their days and nights, often at the tops of their voices. "If you don't stop arguing, I'll leave home," the nearly hysterical Catherine cried out at one point. According to Charlie Taylor, they were never really mad at each other. One morning, after one of their hottest exchanges, he had only just opened the shop at 7 o'clock, as usual, when Orville came in saying he guessed he'd been wrong and they ought to do it Will's way. Shortly after, Wilbur arrived to announce he'd been thinking it over and perhaps Orville was right. The point was, said Charlie, when they were through, they knew where they were and could go ahead with the job. The new flyer, as they called it, would have two propellers positioned between the two wings just to the rear of the operator. One would turn clockwise, the other counterclockwise, so the spinning or gyroscopic action of the one would balance that of the other. Making the propellers with the proper diameter, pitch, and surface area proved no great problem. Each had a diameter of 8.5 feet and were made of 3 spruce laminations glued together and shaped by hand with a hatchet and spoke shaver or draw knife as used by wheelwrights. That they were different from any propellers ever built before was certain, and the last major problem had been resolved. Again, the machine would ride on skids, not wheels. The operator would again lie prone at the controls in the middle of the lower wing. The motor and radiator would be positioned directly beside him on the right. A little 1-gallon gas tank hung overhead on a strut to his left. The drive chains for the propellers were specially made by the Indianapolis Chain Company, and Roebling wire would be used for the trusses between the wings, wire made by the Roeblings who built the Brooklyn Bridge. On March 23rd, the brothers applied for a patent on their flying machine, its wing warping system and rudder. In late April came a letter postmarked Paris from Octave Chanute, who, to help recover from the death of his wife, had been on an extended vacation in Europe. Their experiments were attracting much attention in Paris, he reported to the brothers, adding, "It seems very queer that after having ignored all this series of gliding experiments for several years, the French should now be over-enthusiastic about them." While in Paris, he had given several talks on the subject including one at a formal dinner conference at the Aéro Club de France. What the genial Chanute did not relate was how in these talks he had portrayed his part in the experiments, referring repeatedly to the Wrights as his devoted collaborators. Perhaps it was his pride in Les Frères, or the glow he undoubtedly felt being a center of attention in his native France, where interest in aviation was great. However, the impression he conveyed was that he was their teacher, and they, his daring pupils, were carrying his work to fulfillment. This was not only untrue, but grossly unfair. Great as had been Chanute's interest and encouragement, the brothers had never in any way been his pupils or collaborators. All they had achieved was their own doing, gained by their own original study and effort. Exactly when and how they learned of what Chanute had said in Paris is unclear, but it was not something they were happy about or would forget. Of far greater consequence, however, was Chanute's admirable emphasis on the importance of their glider flights, all of which was a revelation for the French, and even a little disagreeable. As said one of the Aéro Club's leaders, Comte Henri de Laveau, it was time for French aviation experimenters to get seriously to work if they did not wish to be left behind. In his speech and in numerous conversations while in France, Chanute had also provided a great deal of information on the details of the Wright glider, and this would indeed have a profound impact on French aviation. Chanute had agreed to write something for the influential publication L'Aérophile, he informed Wilbur, and would need pictures of him and Orville without delay. After allowing a few weeks to slip by, Wilbur replied good-naturedly that they did not know how to refuse when Chanute had put the matter so nicely, but on the other hand, they had not the courage to face a camera. By mid-May, Chanute was back home and wanted to set a date for Wilbur to come again to Chicago and again address the Western Society of Engineers. He also wished to visit the brothers in Dayton quite soon, as he had information he wished to deliver in person. He arrived the morning of June 6 and returned to Chicago that same night. In the course of the day's conversation, he told the brothers he was giving up his own experiments. From here on, he said, it was all up to them. Wilbur spoke before the gathering in Chicago the evening of June 24th, and with considerably more confidence and spirit than he had 2 years earlier. He described in some detail the breakthrough he and Orville had achieved with the glider they tested at Kitty Hawk the previous fall. He said much about the part the study of birds had played in their work, and of the glides they were able to achieve, putting particular emphasis, as he had before, on the necessity of skill at the controls. More than machinery, skill was needed. 1,000 glides is equivalent to about 4 hours of steady practice, he told the audience, and this was far too little to give anyone a complete mastery of the art of flying. Since soaring is merely gliding in a rising current, it would be easy to soar in front of any hill of suitable slope, whenever the wind blew with sufficient force to furnish support, provided the wind were steady. But by reason of changes in wind velocity, there is more support at times than is needed, while at others there is too little, so that a considerable degree of skill, experience, and sound judgment is required in order to keep the machine exactly in the rising current. Before trying to rise to any dangerous height, a man ought to know that in an emergency, his mind and muscles will work by instinct rather than conscious effort. There is no time to think. A continuing study of soaring birds had convinced them that man could build wings that had as little or less resistance than even the best of the birds. But that was not the point, or the lesson from birds. The bird's wings are undoubtedly very well designed indeed, but it is not any extraordinary efficiency that strikes with astonishment, but rather the marvelous skill with which they are used. At the close, Wilbur declared still again, the soaring problem is apparently not so much one of better wings as of better operators. Asked during a brief discussion period what he thought of experiments being conducted by Alexander Graham Bell to hoist a man into the air with a giant kite, Wilbur replied, "It is very bad policy to ask one flying machine man about the experiments of another, because every flying machine man thinks his method is the only correct one." Asked by another in the audience what he thought of the dihedral angle of the wings used by Samuel Langley, Wilbur did not hesitate to point out that Langley's machine was tested only in dead calms when there were no side gusts to contend with, and that it must be remembered the wind usually blows. Nowhere in the talk had he said a word about the gasoline engine sitting in the back room of the bicycle shop at Dayton, or of his and Orville's intense, often maddening work on propellers, or of what they would be up to at Kitty Hawk in only a matter of months. When the subject of motors came into discussion, he simply kept to the past tense. As none of our experiments has been with power machines, my judgment may be of little value. Day after day that came, the weather in Dayton remained, as Bishop Wright reported, fair and mild. For him, much was all as usual. He went to the library, he wrote letters, attended church, accompanied Catherine at a high school commencement. When she headed off to Oberlin for another commencement, the house of Hawthorne Street grew quieter still. At the shop on West 3rd Street, it was a different story. With the help of Charlie Taylor, the brothers were on the home stretch and working harder than ever to get everything right with every piece and part of the new machine. From Kitty Hawk, Bill Tate sent word that he had installed a gasoline tank at the camp and asked how soon he could expect to see them. On July 14th came the news that in a matter of days, Samuel Langley was to test his latest contrivance on the mosquito-infested banks of the Potomac River near Quantico, Virginia, 30 miles south of Washington. This time it was to be a motor-powered, full-fledged airship called the Great Aerodrome, capable of carrying one operator. It had cost $50,000 in public money, in Smithsonian resources, and the largest appropriation yet granted by the U.S. War Department. Professor Langley and several of his friends, including Alexander Graham Bell, contributed another $20,000. Reporters rushed to the scene, and in a flotilla of watercraft, comprised of everything from catboats to steam launches, converged on the giant houseboat, the Ark as they called it, on top of which perched Langley's machine, the Buzzer, poised to go. Langley himself arrived from Washington and went aboard the houseboat only to disappear inside, refusing to show himself, despite earnest pleas for interviews. When a storm struck, he and his party of mechanics and scientists went back to Washington. Then, with the storm over, the young man who was expected to fly the machine, Charles Manley, hurried off to Washington, but on returning the next day, refused to say anything. At last, on the morning of August 8th, the air perfectly still, an unmanned quarter-scale model of the Langley machine was launched and traveled some 1,000 feet before crashing into the river. "Airship as a submarine," ran the mocking headline in the New York Times. Manley went before reporters to declare the flight entirely successful, but beyond that would say no more. How Wilbur and Orville felt about all this, just as they were about to attempt the most important step in their own work, what comments were exchanged in the privacy of the workshop or at home, there's no telling. The only comment on record, in the letter Wilbur wrote to Octave Chanute, was largely an expression of sympathy for Langley. Professor Langley seems to be having rather more than his fair share of trouble just now with the pestiferous reporters and windstorms. But as the mosquitoes are reported to be very bad along the banks where the reporters are encamped, he has some consolation. Work on their Whopper flying machine, as they had come to call it, continued through the mounting heat of summer, the brothers and Charlie seeing to the final touches on every component, every small detail, before departure for Kitty Hawk, where, they knew, still more work would be required for the assembly of it all. We never did assemble the whole machine at Dayton. There wasn't room enough, Charlie would explain. Just the center section alone was set up in the shop, so blocked passage between the front and back rooms that to wait on customers, he or one or the other of the brothers had to slip out a side door and go around to the street entrance in front. Packing everything for shipment so there would be no damage en route became in itself a major task. Motor, frame, and parts adding up to an estimated 675 pounds. By September 18, all was crated and on the train. There was no ceremony about it or anxiousness, according to Charlie. If there was any worry about the flying machine not working, they never showed it, and I never felt it. 5 days later, Wilbur and Orville themselves were packed and on board an eastbound train. 2. The change from the crowded, stifling, hot, noisy confines of the workspace at Dayton to the open reaches of sea and sky on the Outer Banks could hardly have been greater or more welcome. They loved Kitty Hawk. Every year adds to our comprehension of the wonders of this place, wrote Orville to Catherine soon after arrival. The previous winter on the banks had been especially severe, one continuing succession of storms, the brothers were told, the rain coming down in such torrents as to make a lake that reached for miles near their camp. 90-mile-an-hour winds had lifted their building from its foundation and set it down several feet closer to the ocean. Mosquitoes were said to have been so thick they turned day into night, the lightning so terrible it turned night into day. But the winds had also sculpted the sand hills into the best shape for gliding the brothers had ever seen, and the September days now were so glorious, conditions so ideal, that instead of turning at once to setting up camp, they put the glider from the year before back in shape and spent what Wilbur called the finest day we ever had in practice. They made 75 glides, and with some practice at soaring, found it easier than expected. All was looking highly favorable. With the help of Dan Tate, a new 16 by 44-foot building in which to assemble and store the new flyer went up in little more than a week's time. Its doors hung and hinged just as a terrific storm struck, the wind at one point blowing 75 miles per hour. Progress on the new machine had to go forward, of course, though indoors. Worked all day in making connections of sections of upper wing surface, putting in wires at rear edge, and putting on some hinges, Orville reported on October 12th, the same day Dan Tate reported that 5 boats had already been driven ashore between Kitty Hawk and Cape Henry. On October 18th, as Wilbur wrote to Catherine, a storm hove to view that made the prayers of Elijah look small in comparison. The wind suddenly whirled around to the north and increased to something like 40 miles an hour and was accompanied by a regular cloudburst. In this country, the winds usually blow from the north, then from the east, next the south, and then from the west, and on to the north again. But when the wind begins to back up, that is, veer from south to east and north and so forth, then look out, for it means a cyclone is coming. Maybe it got so in love with backing up that it went forward a little sometimes just to have the fun of backing up again. It repeated this process 7 times in 4 days. The second day opened with the gale still continuing. The climax came about 4 o'clock when the wind reached 75 miles an hour. Suddenly, a corner of our tar paper roof gave way under the pressure, and we saw that if the trouble were not stopped, the whole roof would probably go. Orville put on Wilbur's heavy overcoat, grabbed a ladder, and went out to see what could be done. Wilbur, coatless, followed after, and fighting the wind, found Orville at the north end of the building, having succeeded in climbing the ladder only to have the wind blow the coat over his head. As the hammer and nails were in his pocket and up over his head, Wilbur continued, delighting in telling the story for those at home once the storm had passed, he was unable. Finally, the job was done, and we rushed. Chapter 6. Out at Huffman Prairie. I found them in a pasture lot. The few people who occasionally got a glimpse of the experiments evidently considered it only another Darius Green, but I recognized at once they were really scientific explorers who were serving the world in much the same way that Columbus had when he discovered America. Amos I. Root. 1. It had been agreed earlier at home that were Wilbur and Orville to succeed at Kitty Hawk, Lauren, acting as press agent, would immediately notify the local papers and the Associated Press. So once Catherine had delivered their success telegram to him, Lauren took it downtown to the city editor at the Dayton Daily Journal, Frank Tennyson, who also represented the Associated Press. Tennyson read the telegram and showed no interest. 57 seconds, hey, he said. If it had been 57 minutes, then it might have been a news item. No mention was made of the story in the Journal the following day, though it did get brief attention in the Dayton Daily News on an inside page. Elsewhere in the country, a ludicrously inaccurate account of what the brothers had done got much play as a result of the story that appeared on the front page of the Norfolk Virginian Pilot under a banner headline. Flying machine soars 3 miles in teeth of high winds over hills and waves at Kitty Hawk on Carolina coast. On the afternoon they had sent their telegram from the Kitty Hawk weather station, the brothers had specifically told the operator on duty, Joseph Dosher, that its content was confidential. When the operator at the Norfolk station asked if he could share the news with a friend at the Virginian Pilot, the brothers had Dosher cable back, positively no. It made no difference. From the scant, solid information contained in the telegram, the Virginian Pilot editors concocted an account that was almost entirely contrived. The Wright's machine, according to the story, had been launched from the platform and soared to an altitude of 60 feet. It was described as having 2 6-blade propellers, one raised just below the frame so as to exert an upward force when in motion, and the other extends horizontally from the rear to the center of the car to furnish upward impetus. Wilbur's first historic utterance on flying the 3 miles was reported to have been Eureka. Variations of the account appeared in the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and the Cincinnati Enquirer, among others, but little happened as a consequence. In Boston, however, 2 businessmen, brothers Godfrey and Samuel Cabot of the prominent Cabot family, immediately sensed the story's importance. Godfrey wrote at once to congratulate the Wrights and to ask for more details, which he received in a matter of days. More than satisfied with what he read, he sent off a letter dated December 31st to Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, a distant cousin and known to be a close friend of President Theodore Roosevelt. It seems to me, Cabot wrote, that this may fairly be said to mark the beginning of flight through the air by men unaided by balloons. It has occurred to me that it would be eminently desirable for the United States government to interest itself in this invention. Senator Lodge passed the Cabot letter on to the War Department, where nothing came of it. As for the reaction in Dayton, probably not one person in 100 believed the brothers had actually flown in their machine, or if they had, it could only have been a fluke. Work at the bicycle shop on West 3rd Street resumed, with, as Charlie Taylor said, no jig steps over what had been achieved. Of course, they were pleased with the flight, but their first word with me, as I remember, was about the motor being damaged when the wind picked up the machine and turned it topsy-turvy. They wanted a new one built right away. They were always thinking of the next thing to do. They didn't waste much time worrying about the past. The intention now was to build a heavier version of the Flyer with a more powerful and efficient engine, nor could they neglect earning an income sufficient to cover the expenses both at the shop and at home, not to say the cost of their experiments. As Charlie Taylor would repeatedly remind people, there wasn't any other money. As it was during the first several months of 1904, bike repairs were numbering a steady 15 to 20 a week. Then there were the sales of a great variety of bicycle sundries, as they were referred to in the shop's large ledger books, including bike tires, $3.25 each, bike bells, 10 cents, lamps, $1, pedal guards, 5 cents, spokes, 10 cents, bike pumps, 35 cents. Also, as usual in winter, sharpening ice skates at 15 cents each provided a steady additional sum. Sales of the brothers' own line of bicycles, the larger part of their income, would not pick up until April. So to have a sufficient number on hand took up most of their time at the workbenches behind the shop. The only wages to be covered were Charlie Taylor's $18 a week and Carrie Kaler's $2.50. To help cut expenses for continuing work on their flying machine, it was decided that further expeditions to Kitty Hawk, with all the attendant costs of travel and shipment of tools and materials, could be dispensed with by finding a suitable stretch of open land close to home to serve as a practice field. Wilbur and Orville also wanted Charlie Taylor at hand, and there was concern, too, that the wind-driven sands of Kitty Hawk could play havoc with their engine. The likeliest flying field, they concluded after some investigation, was a peaceful cow pasture of approximately 84 acres, 8 miles northeast of town, called Huffman Prairie. For years, a popular science teacher at the high school, William Werthner, had been bringing his students, including Orville and Catherine, on field trips there, outings Orville loved, which probably had something to do with the choice. The setting was spacious and relatively private, yet nothing like Kitty Hawk, with its broad horizons, wind in abundance, and nearly total privacy. Here the space to maneuver had clearly defined parameters. Barbed wire and trees lined the borders, and there were besides a number of trees within the pasture, including one 50-foot honey locust covered with thorns. The field itself, as Wilbur said, was so full of groundhog hummocks, it might have been a prairie dog town. In addition, the electric interurban trolley line from Dayton to Columbus skirted one side of the property, and so could provide passengers on board ample view of whatever might be going on. The work to be done here, the brothers knew, could well be the final critical stage in the maturation of their whole idea. Here, they would have to learn to do far more than what they had at Kitty Hawk. They must master the art of launching themselves safely into the air, of banking and turning a motor-propelled machine and landing safely. Therefore, Wilbur stressed, they would have to learn to accommodate themselves to circumstances. If space was limited, then all the more need to learn to make controlled turns. If the interurban trolley meant daily public exposure, it would also provide ready, inexpensive transportation, a ride of 40 minutes for a 5-cent fare to and from town, and with a handy stop known as Sims Station at the edge of the field. They also knew the trolley's schedule, so if need be, they had merely to time their flights to those hours when no one would be passing by. The pasture belonged to Torrance Huffman, president of Dayton's Fourth National Bank, whom the Wrights knew. When they inquired if they might rent it for their use, he said there would be no charge, so long as they moved the cows and horses outside the fence before flying their machine. While he liked the brothers well enough, Huffman was among the many who had little faith in their project. "They're fools," he told the farmer who worked the adjoining land. Meanwhile, in what time they had to themselves, the brothers were sawing and planing lumber for the ribs of the new machine and working with Charlie Taylor on the new motor. Their nephew Milton, who as a boy was often hanging about the brothers, would one day write, history was being made in their bicycle shop and in their home, but the making was so obscured by the commonplace, I did not recognize it until many years later. With the advance of spring in 1904, Wilbur and Orville could be seen out in the grass of Huffing Prairie, swinging scythes or working with shovels, leveling off groundhog mounds. When it came to building a shed in which to assemble and store their new machine, they put it in a corner as far removed from the trolley stop as the field permitted. Prior to their first test flight, lest anyone think them overly secretive, the brothers invited friends and neighbors to come and watch. The press would be welcome too, but on the condition that no photographs be taken. Their concern centered on the chance of photographs being used to study those devices and control mechanisms of their own invention and set their machine apart from others. On May 23, a Monday, despite an early morning rain, some 50 spectators gathered in Huffman Prairie. Bishop Wright, Captain, Warren, and family were all present, as were a dozen or more reporters. But there was too little wind, and the test flight had to be postponed. Motor or not, wind was still essential. On Wednesday, when the crowd gathered again, rain caused another cancellation. The morning after, May 26, there was more rain. But then, during a brief lull in the afternoon, and with hardly any wind and signs of another storm about to break, the brothers decided to make a start. Orville at the controls, Flyer 2 rose a mere 8 feet and came down at once, within seconds after leaving the starting track. Something had gone wrong with the motor. It was hardly a premiere to stir excitement or silence the doubters. A few reporters, in an attempt to say something of interest, either praised the sturdiness of the machine or took liberties with the facts, such as to say the plane had gone 75 feet in the air. Bishop Wright, who had been watching with perhaps greater anticipation than anyone present, could only record in his diary, and accurately, that Orville had flown all of 25 feet. It would be speculated later by some that the failure that day had been a hoax staged as a way to deflate further interest by the public and the press. But this seems absurd given the nature of the brothers and the fact that almost nothing went right for them for the next 3 months. On June 10th, the machine hit the ground because of faulty steering. Another day, a tail was smashed during a landing. Tail stick broken in starting. Wilbur recorded of his flight on August 2. On another, the tail wires became disarranged. On August 5, Orville struck ground at start. Wilbur went again on August 8, and a wing hit the ground before leaving the track. 2 days later, a rudder was smashed, a propeller broken. It seemed, as Wilbur would say, they had become a little rusty at the art of flying. There was nothing spectacular about these many trials, remembered Werthner, the high school science teacher, who was lending the brothers a hand with their great white bird, as he called it. But the good humor of Wilbur after a spill out of the machine, or a break somewhere, or a stubborn motor, was always reassuring. Their patient perseverance, their calm faith in ultimate success, their mutual consideration of each other, might have been considered phenomenal in any but men who were well born and well reared. These flights or spurts of flying, they always made in turn, and after every trial, the two inventors, quite apart, held long and confidential consultation with always some new gain. They were getting nearer and nearer the moment when sustained flight would be made, for a machine that could maintain itself aloft 2 minutes might just as well stay there an hour if everything were as intended. At last, on August 13, to their utter amazement, Wilbur flew over 1,000 feet, farther than any of the flights at Kitty Hawk, and 5 times what they had been able to do thus far at Huffman Prairie. "Have you heard what they're up to out there?" people in town would say. "Oh, yes," would be the usual answer, and the conversation would move on. Few took any interest in the matter, or in the 2 brothers who were to become Dayton's greatest heroes ever. Even those riding the interurban line seemed to have paid little or no attention to what could occasionally be seen in passing, or to the brothers themselves as they traveled back and forth from town on the same trolley, looking little different from other commuters. An exception was Luther Beard, managing editor of the Dayton Journal, who, because of a class he taught occasionally at a school near Huffman Prairie, rode the interurban as far as Sim Station. "I used to chat with him in a friendly way and was always polite to them," Beard would recall, "because I sort of felt sorry for them. They seemed like well-meaning, decent enough young men, yet there they were, neglecting their business to waste their time day after day on that ridiculous flying machine. They were also putting their lives at risk, as well they knew. On a flight on August 24, hit by a sudden gust of wind, Orville smashed into the ground at 30 miles an hour, and though he suffered no broken bones, was so badly shaken and bruised he was unable to fly for another month. Where Samuel Langley had required the least wind possible for his aerodrome experiments, the Wrights needed more wind. Clearly, at Huffman Prairie, they would have to make up for what had been so plentiful at Kitty Hawk, to devise, in Wilbur's words, some way to render us independent of wind. The solution would have to be both simple and inexpensive, and so once again, straightforward improvisation solved the problem. They designed and built their own starting apparatus, a catapult powered by nothing more than gravity. Its components consisted of a 20-foot tent-shaped tower, or derrick, made with 4 wooden poles that looked like a drilling rig. At the apex, over a pulley, hung by a single rope, metal weights totaling as much as 1,600 pounds. The rest of the rope ran from the base of the tower down the launching track on pulleys to the end of the track to another pulley. Then the rope ran back again to the starting point, where it hitched onto the front of the flyer, which sat on the launching track on a large rimmed bicycle hub. With a team of horses, the brothers would haul the weights up to the top of the derrick. Then, when all was ready, the pilot would release the rope, the weights would drop, the machine would be pulled rapidly down to the end of the track, then shoot into the air at a speed greater by far than possible when attempting takeoff by motor only. On September 7, with scarcely any wind, Wilbur tested the new catapult for the first time, starting with only 200 pounds of weights. By day's end, having added another 400 pounds, he could take off with no difficulties and flew longer distances than ever. Little more than a week later, on September 15, he not only flew fully half a mile, but for the first time succeeded in turning a half circle, a major achievement. Not one reporter bothered to attend during this time, nor did public interest increase. With few exceptions, there seemed no public interest at all, no local excitement or curiosity or sense of wonder over the miraculous thing happening right in Dayton's own backyard. Nor did anyone seem to appreciate the kind of minds, not to say the extraordinary skill and courage needed to succeed in so daring a venture. In 5 months, the brothers were to make no less than 50 test flights at Huffman Prairie, and Charlie Taylor, ever on hand in case of motor trouble, would say that every time he watched either of them head down the starting track, he had the awful feeling he might never again see him alive. To Wilbur and Orville, it seemed fear was a stranger. Writing his autobiography later, James Cox, publisher of the Dayton Daily News, remembered reports coming to our office that the airship had been in the air over the Huffman Prairie, but our news staff would not believe the stories. nor did they ever take the pains to go out to sea, nor did Cox. When the city editor of the Daily News, Dan Cumler, was asked later why for so long nothing was reported of the momentous accomplishments taking place so nearby, he said after a moment's reflection, "I guess the truth is that we were just plain dumb." 2. That same September, 200 miles to the northeast in Ohio, a small elderly gentleman set off in his automobile, as he had before, earlier in the summer, for Huffman Prairie on invitation from the Wrights to come see the progress they were making. He was Amos Ives Root of Medina, a town just south of Cleveland. Always neatly dressed, his short white beard trimmed, he stood no more than 5'3", but his energy and curiosity were great indeed. His bright hazel eyes seemed to miss nothing. Born in a log cabin, he had started his own business, manufacturing and marketing beekeeping supplies, in 1869 at age 30, and soon became widely known as the Bee Man of Ohio. At 64, he was extremely well off, happily married, a father of 5, proud grandfather, and quite free to pursue a whole range of active interests. As would be said in the Medina County newspaper, Amos Root bubbled with enthusiasm and a constant desire to see the wheels go round. He loved clocks, windmills, bicycles, machines of all kinds, and especially his Oldsmobile runabout. Seldom was he happier than when out on the road in it and in all seasons. While I like horses in a certain way, he wrote, I do not enjoy caring for them. I do not like the smell of the stable. I do not like to be obliged to clean a horse every morning. And I do not like to hitch one up in winter. It takes time to hitch up a horse. The auto is ready to start off in an instant. It's never tired. It gets there quicker than any horse can possibly do. As for the Oldsmobile, he liked to say, at $350, it cost less than a horse and a carriage. He was also deeply religious, a Sunday school teacher, an active supporter of the temperance movement, and enjoyed conveying his thoughts and ideas on these and a host of other topics in a column he wrote for the Root Company's Beekeepers Trade Union, Gleanings in Bee Culture. It was to be he, of all people, the Ohio Bee Man, who would recognize as no one yet had the genius of the Wrights and the full importance of their flying machine. He would describe in detail what he saw happen at Huffman Prairie, and further, he would describe it accurately. It was not the Dayton papers that finally broke the story, or the Chicago Tribune, or the New York Times, or Scientific American, but Amos Root's own Gleanings in Bee Culture. He had begun correspondence with the Wrights in February. I hope you will excuse me, friends, for the liberty I take in addressing you. Let me say briefly that I have all my life had an idea in my head that a flying machine should be made on the principle of flying a kite. He wanted very much, he continued, to be on hand for their experiments and promised never to undertake to borrow any of your ideas. In response, the brothers said they would let him know when their new machine was ready for trial. Through spring and into summer, waiting for word to come, Root kept writing. Please excuse me, friends, but I am so anxious to see that airship, I can hardly sleep nights. When in mid-August, word finally came, he was off at once for Dayton in his runabout, a journey of no little uncertainty then, given the state of the roads. He had arrived at the time when the Wrights machine was not performing well, certainly not as they wished. But for Root, the spectacle of actual flight was one of the bright spots in my life, as he told them in gratitude. He had promised he would say nothing of what he had seen at Huffman Prairie in anything he wrote in his Gleanings in Bee Culture, and good as his word, He described only his venture by automobile. In a recent trip of 400 miles through Ohio, he wrote, I passed through Ashland, Mansfield, Marion, Delaware, Marysville, Springfield, Dayton. So many different towns in a brief period of time that I can hardly remember now which was which. He told how he tried and succeeded in not killing any of the numerous chickens on the road or scaring any of the horses. He wrote of having to give the engine fresh water every 10 or 15 miles, and how wherever he stopped, the water or gasoline, a crowd gathered. He described the torn-up streets and mud roads in the winter. He then could not resist adding, and by the way, we are already, at least to some extent, ignoring not only mud roads, but roads of every kind, and climbing through the air. And I do not mean by means of the gas balloon either. But I am not at liberty just now to tell all I know in regard to this matter. In the second week of September, came word from the Wrights that he should return without delay. He reached Dayton on Tuesday, September 20, 1904, the day Wilbur would attempt something never done before in the history of the world. He would fly a power machine in a complete circle. Still recovering from his crash in August, Orville would be on the sidelines, watching with Ruth and Charlie Taylor. Apparently no one else was on hand in Huffman Prairie. God, in his great mercy, has permitted me to be at least somewhat instrumental in ushering in and introducing to the great wide world an invention that may outrank electric cars, the automobiles, and may fairly take a place beside the telephone and wireless telegraphy. Root would begin his eyewitness account. But before describing what he saw happen, he made a point of stressing that the Wrights were not just the sort who loved machinery, but were interested in the modern developments of science and art. He had been astonished by the extent of their library and to find in conversation that they were thoroughly not only in regard to their present knowledge, but everything that had been done in the past. In saying this and what he wrote, he would be the first to recognize how much more there was to Wilbur and Orville than most imagined, even among the relative few who took time to give it some thought. They were not simply another Darius Green, Root stressed, but scientific explorers, serving the world much as Columbus had. He described in his account of September 20 how Wilbur took his place lying flat to offer less steam resistance, how the engine was warmed up to speed, and how with everything ready, a sort of trap, was sprung, and suddenly the machine was aloft. The plane flew low, never rising more than 20 to 25 feet above the ground. I was surprised at the speed, and I was astonished at the wonderful lifting power. Then it turned and headed straight back toward him, and with feelings very like those expressed by John T. Daniels after seeing the first flight of Kitty Hawk, he wrote, "When it first turned that circle and came near the starting point, I was right in front of it. And I said then, and I believe still, it was one of the grandest sights, if not the grandest sight of my life." The plane was still flying low, and Orville, who was standing close by Root, urged him to get to one side, for fear it might suddenly come down. To Root, the landing of the plane was hardly less amazing. When the engine is shut off, the apparatus glides to the ground very quietly and alights on something like a pair of light sled runners, skids, sliding over the grassy surface, perhaps a rod or more. Whenever it is necessary to slow up the speed before alighting, you turn the nose uphill. It will then climb right up on the air until the momentum is exhausted, when by skillful management, it can be dropped as lightly as a feather. The skillful management was breathtaking. It was not just that the machine was like no other on the face of the earth, he wrote, but there was probably no one beyond these two who learned the trick of controlling it. When Columbus discovered America, he did not know what the outcome would be, Root would conclude his account. Not even the wildest enthusiast could have foreseen. In a like manner, these two brothers have probably not even a faint glimpse of what their discovery is going to bring to the children of men. As for Huffman Prairie, it was henceforth historic ground. Here man and his machine had learned to fly, very much like a young bird out of its nest learns by practice to use its wings. Root pictured a wondrous time near at hand, when we shall not need to fuss with good roads, nor railway tracks, bridges, and so forth, at such enormous expense. With these machines, we bid adieu to all these things. God's free air that extends all over the earth, and perhaps miles above us, is our training field. When you see one of these graceful crafts sailing over your head, and possibly over your home, as I expect you will in the near future, see if you don't agree with me that the flying machine is one of God's most gracious and precious gifts. In December, Amos Root returned to Dayton, and by the interurban this time, and met with the Wrights at 7 Hawthorne to read aloud what he had written in advance of publication. It was one last step to ensure accuracy, and apparently it all went well. What suggested changes, if any, or comments the Wrights may have offered are not known. Why they had put such trust in Root was never explained, but clearly they had much in common. He too, in the early days of his beekeeping enterprise, had been taken for a nut. He had succeeded with his ideas only by close study. Importantly, beginning with his first visit in August, he had shown himself true to his word and ready to cooperate in any way he could to achieve accuracy in what he wrote. Like their father, he was a man of strong religious convictions, and it was of no small importance that Bishop Wright approved. As he wrote in his diary, Mr. Root seems to be a fine gentleman. Perhaps above all, Wilbur and Orville knew from their first meeting with Root that his regard for them was altogether genuine, his belief in the possibility of human flight no less than their own. At the time his article appeared in Gleanings in Bee Culture in January 1905, Root sent a copy to the editor of Scientific American, saying it could be reprinted at no charge. The editor paid it no mind. Instead, in an article published a full year later, The Wright Aeroplane and its fabled performances, the magazine chose to cast still more doubt. If such sensational and tremendously important experiments are being conducted in a not very remote part of the country on a subject in which almost everybody feels the most profound interest, is it possible to believe that the enterprising American reporter, who, it is well known, comes down the chimney and the door is locked in his face, would not have ascertained all about them and published long ago? The thought that Amos Root was the enterprising reporter apparently never entered the editor's mind. For their part, the brothers refused to get worked up or to speak out. If they will not take our word and the word of many witnesses, wrote Wilbur, we do not think they will be convinced until they see a flight with their own eyes. 3. In October, a month after Amos Root's visit, came the first clear sign that if the American press and the U.S. government had no interest, there were those on the other side of the Atlantic who did. An officer of the British Army's balloon section, Lieutenant Colonel John Edward Chapper, appeared in Dayton and did not hesitate to inform the brothers of the atomic request of the government. Reluctant to have him come with them to Huffman Prairie just yet, they instead showed him photographs of recent flights. But it was they themselves who impressed the visitor more than anything, and he invited them to submit a proposal for the sale of their flyer crew to the British government. They were unwilling to comply, partly because they were not ready to begin considering what we will do with our baby now that we have it, as Wilbur confided to Octave Chanute. Furthermore, as patriotic Americans, they would be ashamed to offer it to a foreign government without their own country having a first chance. On November 9, in celebration of President Theodore Roosevelt's resounding election, Wilbur flew almost 4 circles around the field at Huffman Prairie. Then on the third day of the new year, 1905, he called on the newly elected local congressman, Republican Robert Nevin, to explain the situation. Nevin suggested that Wilbur write a proposal for Secretary of War William Howard Taft. The letter, dated January 18 and signed by both Wilbur and Orville, stated that their efforts of the past 5 years had produced a flying machine that not only flies through the air at high speed, but it also lands without being wrecked. During 1904, they had made 105 flights. They had flown in straight lines, circles, over S-shaped courses, in calms and great winds, and brought flying to the point where it could be of great practical use in various ways, one of which is that of scouting and carrying messages in time of war. Congressman Nevin forwarded the letter to the War Department. From there, it was passed on to the Board of Ordnance and Fortification, the same agency that had seen the $50,000 it provided to Samuel Langley come to nothing. Congressman Nevin then received a standard formal rejection from the board, dated January 26, explaining that so great were the number of requests for allotments for experiments in mechanical flight that the device in question must first stage a practical operation at no expense to the United States. And from Wilbur and Orville's letter, it appeared to the board that their machine had not yet reached that stage. It was a standard reply sent irrespective of the fact that the Wrights had made no appeal for financial support. Possibly this was an instance of extreme wariness within the board because of the Langley experience of becoming involved again with experimental aviation. Or it could have been a case of plain bureaucratic ineptitude, or that the claims made by the Wrights for their flyer, like those in so many crank proposals, seemed too preposterous to be taken seriously. To Wilbur and Orville, it was a flat turndown, which they seemed to have been expecting. We have taken pains to see that opportunity gave a good, clear knock on the War Department door, Wilbur wrote Octave Chanute. It has for years been our business practice to sell to those who wish to buy, instead of trying to force goods upon people who did not want them. If the American government has decided to spend no more money on flying machines till their practical use has been demonstrated in actual service abroad, we are sorry, but we cannot reasonably object. They are the judges. The brothers had already written to Colonel Capper in England to say they were ready to make their proposal. The British War Office responded at once, and serious correspondence began. As always, they had no time to waste. Work went on. A new 1905 Flyer 3 was underway, a machine of practical utility, as the Wrights would say. In fact, the Flyer 3 would prove to be the first practical airplane in history. Talk of ideas continued without cease among themselves and with Charlie Taylor, while at work in the shop or standing beside the Flyer between tests at Huffman Prairie, or at work inside the shed, or while riding the trolley. The fascination with birds continued no less than ever. If Ohio offered nothing comparable to the multitudes of gannets and gulls and buzzards in the skies of the Outer Banks, Ohio provided crows aplenty. Birds unquestionably develop power many times greater than is consumed by our Flyer per pound weight, Wilbur wrote to Octave Chanute. If you will fix in your mind the distance within which a small bird acquires full speed, say 30 miles an hour, and then figure the power necessary to accelerate its weight to this velocity, I think you will be astonished. And there was more, always more, to learn and think about. The new Flyer 3 was more sturdily built than its predecessor, its motor more powerful, producing as much as 25 horsepower. The double rudder had been enlarged, the wing area slightly reduced, and the leading edges of the wings made more effective. But the improvements this time, as the brothers would stress, resulted mainly from more scientific design and changes in methods of balancing and steering. The most important change was to move the forward rudder even farther forward for better longitudinal or nose-to-tail control. They had discovered that most of their troubles could be remedied by tilting the machine forward a little so its flying speed could be restored. The best dividends on the labor invested, they said, have invariably come from seeking more knowledge rather than more power. Once the test flights got underway in June, it became clear the improvements were working. Moreover, the two pilots were rusty no longer. In one important close call on September 28th, as Orville would recount, he was circling the great honey locust tree when the machine suddenly began to turn up one wing and stall. The operator, not relishing the idea of landing in a thorn tree, attempted to reach the ground. The left wing struck the tree at a height of 10 to 12 feet and carried away several branches. But by putting the plane into a brief dive, Orville was able to nose the plane upward again, and the flight, which had already covered 6 miles, continued on to the starting point. The lesson learned was another step forward. The brief dive had restored the speed needed to increase the lift and thereby straighten the effect of the warp. Wilbur by then had flown 11 miles on a single run, Orville 12 miles, then 15. For both of them, this, their Flyer 3, with its improvements, was as big an advance as Flyer 1 had proven to be at Kitty Hawk. It was at Huffman Prairie that summer and fall of 1905 that the brothers, by experiment and change, truly learned to fly. Then, also, at last, with a plane they could rely on, they could permit themselves enjoyment in what they had achieved. They could take pleasure in the very experience of traveling through the air in a motor-powered machine as no one had. And each would try as best he could to put the experience in words. When you know after the first few minutes that the whole mechanism is working perfectly, Wilbur was to say, the sensation is so keenly delightful as to be almost beyond description. Nobody who has not experienced it for himself can realize it. It is a realization of a dream so many persons have had of floating in the air. More than anything else, the sensation is one of perfect peace, mingled with the excitement that strains every nerve to the utmost, if you can conceive of such a combination. Once into the air, Orville would write, the ground was a perfect blur, but as the plane rose higher, the objects below became clearer. At the height of 100 feet, you feel hardly any motion at all, except for the wind which strikes your face. If you did not take the precaution to fasten your hat before starting, you have probably lost it by this time. The operator moves a lever. The right wing rises, and the machine swings about to the left. You make a very short turn, yet you do not feel the sensation of being thrown from your seat, so often experienced in automobile and railway travel. You find yourself facing toward the point from which you started. The objects on the ground now seem to be moving at much higher speed, though you perceive no change in the pressure of the wind on your face. You know then that you are traveling with the wind. When you near the starting point, the operator stops the motor while still high in the air. The machine coasts down at an oblique angle to the ground, and after sliding 50 or 100 feet, comes to rest. Although the machine often lands when traveling at a speed of a mile a minute, you feel no shock whatever, and cannot, in fact, tell the exact moment at which it first touched the ground. The motor close beside you kept up an almost deafening roar during the whole flight. Yet in your excitement, you did not notice it till it stopped. By now, the brothers were openly encouraging family and friends to ride out and see the show. Bishop Wright and Catherine, Lauren and his wife and children, and some 17 friends and neighbors came by trolley or automobile, and many more than once. Next-door neighbors John Fate and his son George were among them. Lawrence Hoffman, doubter no longer, brought along 3 of his children. Charles Weber came to watch, and did Frank Hale, the grocer, and brother W.C. Faust, whose respected establishment, a close-by bicycle shop in West 3rd Street. And Frank Hamburger, the hardware dealer, whose inventory Wilbur and Orville had helped save at the time of the 1898 flood. In the afternoon of October 5, 1905, before more than a dozen witnesses, Wilbur circled the pasture 29 times, landing only when his gas ran out. I saw Wilbur fly 24 miles in 38 minutes and 4 seconds in one flight, wrote the bishop. In fact, this one flight was by far the longest yet, longer than all the 160 flights of the 3 previous years combined. By the time the experiments ended, the brothers had made 105 starts at Huffman Prairie and thought it time now to put their creation, Flyer 3, on the market. By this point, too, the Dayton press had at last awakened. The Wrights, reported the Daily News, were making sensational flights every day, as local witnesses were happy to attest. W.C. Faust, the druggist, was quoted saying, "When I went out to Huffman Prairie, I expected to see somebody's neck broken. What I did see was a machine weighing 900 pounds soar away like an eagle. I told a friend about it that night, and he acted as if he thought I had gone daft or joined the Liars Club." An American correspondent for a German aeronautical journal had come to Huffman Prairie and begun a series of articles on the brothers. The French were beginning to make inquiries. Prodded by Octave Chanute to try one more time to rouse interest in Washington, on the chance that the new president of the Board of Ordnance and Fortification, Major General J.C. Bates, might be of different mind, the brothers wrote again. Their earlier proposal appeared to have been given scant consideration, they said, in their letter of October 9. "We do not wish to take this invention abroad unless we find it necessary to do so, and therefore write again, renewing the offer." By this time, the brothers were routinely making controlled flights in their aircraft of 25 miles or more. But the response from Washington, as Catherine wrote to the bishop, was the same thing that they had before. The only difference was they were told that before any consideration of their machine, they must provide such drawings and descriptions as are necessary to enable construction, something the Wrights refused to do. They tried again, asking what requirements and performance were expected by the board, and were told the board did not care to formulate any requirements until a machine was produced and able to provide horizontal flight and to carry an operator. A sampling of photographs of Flyer 3 in action could have been requested, or a visit to Huffman Prairie by someone from Washington might well have resolved the issue. Told what the response of the board had been, Octave Chanute concluded, "Those fellows are a bunch of asses." Progress with the English having stalled, Wilbur informed an interested group in Paris that he and Orville were ready to discuss sale of the Flyer 3 to the French government. In the last week of 1905, Bishop Wright recorded in his diary, "Thursday, December 28. The morning was beautiful and a fire hardly needed. A Frenchman named Arnold Fordyce came to investigate and drive a trade for a flying machine. They agreed on terms. Fordyce represented a syndicate of wealthy French businessmen, but the Wrights assumed the deciding authority would be the French military, which was the case. The syndicate would purchase a Wright flyer as a gift to the French government. According to the agreement, the brothers were to receive 1 million francs, or $200,000, for one machine, on the condition that they provided demonstration flights during which the machine fulfilled certain requirements in altitude, distance, and speed. Details of the final terms were to be negotiated by a French commission assigned to come to Dayton. Meantime, a sum of 25,000 francs, or $5,000, was to be deposited in a New York bank in escrow. $200,000 was an exceedingly large sum, and the $5,000 the brothers were to receive, however the further negotiations went, would more than cover all the expenses they had had since first going to Kitty Hawk. Saturday, December 30. In the afternoon, wrote the bishop in his diary, Wilbur and Orville signed up the contract with Mr. Arnold Fordyce of Paris. Chapter 7.
Awesome.
A capital Exhibit A.
Let's do it.
He inspires great confidence. Hart O. Berg. You people at home must stop worrying. There's no need of it. Wilbur Wright. 1. The four well-dressed French gentlemen and the American accompanying them were the subject of much talk almost from the moment on March 20, 1906, when they walked into the lobby of the Beckel Hotel in Dayton to register at the front desk. Word was out that the Wright boys had made arrangements to sell their flying machine to the French, but when a reporter for the Dayton Herald inquired of the head of the delegation, Arnold Fordyce, if this were so, his reply was they had come merely to see the sights. He was writing a book about the customs and industries of America, he said.
Oh, let's go.
Dayton was one of 4 cities on the tour. He did add, however, and most cordially, that they hoped to call on the Wright brothers while in town. Arnold Fordyce had once been an actor. In truth, the men had come with no other purpose than to meet with the Wrights. 3 of the group, despite their business suits, were French Army officers. Commandant Henri Bonnel was chief of engineers of the French General Staff, the only one of the group who spoke no English, and an acknowledged skeptic concerning the Wrights and their flying machine. Captains Henri Renier and Jules Fournier were military attachés from the French embassy in Washington. The one American, Walter Berry, represented the French ambassador to the United States. An international attorney, Berry spent most of his time in Paris, where he figured prominently in the social life of the noted American novelist Edith Wharton, and was well attuned to moving in influential circles on both sides of the Atlantic. The year 1906 thus far had not been particularly promising for the brothers. Their work proceeded on a new, more powerful engine, but they were doing no flying. Meanwhile, in France, there was growing excitement over the progress in aviation being made by French manufacturers and such glamorous aviators as Louis Blériot and the Brazilian-born Alberto Santo Dumont, while the Paris Herald, an English-language paper, mocked the brothers in an editorial titled "Liars for Liars." The Wrights have flown or they have not flown. They possess a machine or they do not possess one. They are in fact either flyers or liars. It is difficult to fly. It is easy to say we have flown. Now here were the brothers sitting down with the French delegation that had come to talk seriously. That it could be a most important step forward for all involved went without saying. As Bishop Wright recorded, they met above the bicycle shop every day for more than 2 weeks, and with the bishop too sitting in on the discussion. On the evening of March 24, at the invitation of Captain Wright, Fordyce, Commandant Bonnel, and Walter Berry supped with the family at 7 Hawthorne Street. The brothers refused to show the delegation their Flyer 3, but willingly provided photographs and eyewitness testimony of the plane in flight. In little time, even Commandant Bonnell, the skeptic of the group, was convinced, impressed primarily by the Wrights themselves and despite the language barrier. While no agreement resulted, the possibility of a future working arrangement with the French had been strongly reinforced, and respect on both sides greatly strengthened, a point the brothers emphasized in a letter to Bonnell written April 6. Notwithstanding the failure to reach an agreement at our final conference last evening, we shall always remain very friendly to you personally and to your country. Allow us to express our hearty appreciation of your uniform fairness and courtesy throughout this long conference. But by now, much of the scientific world and the press had begun to change their perspective on the brothers, with Scientific American making the most notable change. In its issue of April 7, 1906, the magazine carried an article titled "The Wright Airplane and Its Performances," in which 11 eyewitnesses to flights by the brothers at Huffman Prairie, in answer to 12 specific questions, affirmed that they had seen one or the other of the brothers fly in their machine in varying winds and perform all manner of movements with complete control throughout. Included too in the article was a letter from Charles Weber, from whom the Wrights rented the bicycle shop, telling how in October he had witnessed Orville flying the machine for about half an hour and how the machine had traveled in large circles of about a mile around, and how the flyer was absolutely free from the time it left the rail upon which it started until it touched the ground in making its final landing. On May 22, 1906, the patent applied for in 1903 was at last issued on the Wright flying machine, patent number 821393. And through the rest of that spring and summer, preoccupation with a new engine for Flyer 3 went on, and flight tests continued at Huffman Prairie into the fall. In France, Alberto Santo Dumont, flying what looked like a motor-powered hodgepodge of box kites, had made a public flight covering 726 feet. French aviation enthusiasts went wild with excitement. Santo Dumont was said to have gained the greatest glory to which man can aspire. He had achieved a decisive step in the history of aviation, and not in secret. I fancy that he is now very nearly where you were in 1904, wrote Octave Chanute to Wilbur. Fear that others will produce a machine capable of practical service in less than several years does not worry us, Wilbur would reply confidently. We have been over the course and understand how much yet remains for them to do. Then came overtures from Flint and Company, a New York firm with extensive experience in marketing war materials in Europe. By December, the overtures had become serious. Flint and Company was offering the Wrights $500,000 for the sales rights of their plane outside the United States. The Wrights would maintain the American market. By nature, the more entrepreneurial of the two, Orville showed the most interest, and it was he who went to New York, met with the head of the firm, Charles Flint, and made a deal, or so it seemed. Further issues required further discussion, so early in the new year, 1907, both Orville and Wilbur took the train to New York. The tempo of financial possibilities was picking up considerably. In February, Germany offered $500,000 for 50 Wright flyers, and the brothers agreed that Flint and Company should be their sales representative, but only their sales representative, on a 20% commission everywhere except in the United States. Then in May came an urgent message from Charles Flint saying the company's European representative, Hart O'Byrne, had become skeptical about the Wrights and their machine and wanted one or the other, or both, to come to Europe as soon as possible and make their case themselves. All expenses, of course, to be covered by Flint and Company. Wilbur thought Orville should go. Wilbur wanted to see to the finishing touches on the new engine and prepare the Flyer 3 for shipment. I am more careful than he is, Wilbur would explain to their father. Further, the one who went to Europe would have to act almost entirely on his own judgment, without much consultation by letter or cable. Wilbur felt he was more willing to accept the consequences of any errors of judgment on Orville's part than to have Orville blaming him if he were to go. Orville stubbornly disagreed, insisting that Wilbur would make the best impression in France. And Orville was right, as they all knew, including Wilbur. He grabbed a few things and left for New York. By Saturday, May 18th, he was on board the RMS Campania, sailing past the Statue of Liberty on his way out to sea. An entirely new adventure had begun, unlike anything he or any of the family had yet experienced. Wilbur had just turned 40 that evening, and was to be on his own, far from home, separated from his family, for longer than he had ever been or ever imagined, and tested in ways he had never known. 2. I sailed this morning about 9 o'clock, and we are now something over 200 miles out, Wilbur wrote in a letter addressed to Catherine, but intended for all at home. The St. Louis and another ship started at the same time, but we have run off from them. The Campania, part of the Cunard Line, was known as one of the finest vessels of its kind and one of the fastest, a flying palace of the ocean, which Wilbur particularly liked. The ship was 622 feet in length, with 2 tall stacks, and burnt some 500 tons of coal per day. The predominant interior style was Art Nouveau, with staterooms and public rooms paneled in satinwood and mahogany and thickly carpeted. The weather was splendid, the sea smooth, and he had a cabin to himself. With only about half the usual number of passengers on board, he was able to get a $250 cabin for only $100, and he was quite happy about that too, even if Flint was covering the expenses. He made 466 miles the first day, he wrote the following evening, and left the other boats out of sight. The third day out, he took a tour of the engine room, marveling at the scale of it all. Engines half as high as an office building back home. Engines that could deliver 28,000 horsepower. This in contrast to the 25 horsepower of the new engine for Flyer 3. There were 12 boilers and over 100 furnaces. The ship's propellers measured no less than 23 feet in diameter. He kept note of the miles made day by day and walked the promenade deck 5 to 10 miles a day. Though he wrote nothing about the food served or the other passengers, he seemed to be having a fine time. All went ideally until the 6th day out, when a storm hit, and Wilbur had his first experience with pitch and roll on water, not in the air. The waves are probably 10 feet high, and the ship pitches considerably. Fortunately, there is but little roll. The spray was such that the promenade decks were useless. The ship had become more like a hospital, though he himself felt only a little sick just after breakfast. The last day at sea, off the Irish coast, he wrote of seeing gulls at intervals and how they could skim within a foot or two of the waves, and in strong winds did not even have to flap their wings very much. After landing at Liverpool at first light Saturday, May 25, Wilbur went by train to London, where at Euston Station he was met by the Flint & Company sales representative, Art Nouveau, an American who recognized Wilbur the moment he stepped off the train. I had never seen a picture of him or had him described to me in any way, Fred would write to Charles Flint. And either I am a Sherlock Holmes or Wright has a peculiar genius in his eye, which left no doubt in my mind as to who he was. Fred also noticed Wilbur's luggage consisted of a single leather grip the size of a doctor's bag, and his wardrobe left much to be desired. But on the way to the hotel, it was Wilbur who suggested it might be advisable to Restream to buy new suits. At a tailor shop in the Strand, Berg fixed him up with both a dress suit and a tuxedo. When Wilbur's account of these purchases reached home, Catherine wrote at once to tell him how Orb had marched off to Perry Meredith's haberdashery this morning and ordered the same for himself. Intent on wasting no time, Berg told Wilbur there was little likelihood of doing business in England, and the sooner they left for France, the better. The main effort would be made in Paris. They also found themselves disagreeing on the best approach, whether to deal with governments primarily or with individuals. Berg much in favor of individuals. Either way, both agreed it would be best not to make much of Wilbur's presence in Europe, not for the time being at least. Summing things up at the close of his long memorandum to Charles Smith, Berg stressed how pleased he was with Wilbur's whole bearing and attitude. He inspires great confidence, Berg, and I am sure he will be capital exhibit A. How Wilbur felt about Berg at this point is not clear. Though fellow Americans of roughly the same age and backgrounds and experiences in life can hardly have been more different. Born to a Jewish family in Philadelphia and raised in New York, Berg had attended private schools until sent off to Europe to be trained as an engineer at Liège in Belgium. In the time since, he had become a pioneer in the manufacture of pistols, machine guns, automobiles, and submarines. He had worked at the Colt Firearms Factory in Hartford, Connecticut, maintained his own sales office in Paris, and spent 3 years in Russia, where he obtained orders from the Tsar for building 10 submarines. Where Wilbur was lean and rumpled, Berg was stout and immaculate in attire. Berg was fluent in several languages and well-connected, with contacts in high places throughout Europe. And though arms dealers, merchants of death, were an anathema to many, he seems to have been well-liked and respected by nearly everyone. Berg and his wife Edith, also an American, had lived in Paris for years, and the French held him in high regard. In 1901, he had been made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. From London to Dover, then across the Channel, Wilbur and Berg were joined by another Flint executive, Frank Cordley. They arrived in Paris on the evening of May 27th, when it was still daylight, and checked into the luxurious Hotel Maurice on the Rue de Rivoli. The Tuileries Palace and the Louvre were only a couple of squares to our left, Wilbur reported that same night to Catherine and the family. The Column Vendôme is behind us, and the Place de la Concorde and Arc de Triomphe are farther up the Champs-Élysées. We are right in the most beautiful and interesting part of the city. He was also residing in one of the finest hotels in all Paris, indeed in all Europe. The new Hotel Maurice, as said, had only just reopened after major refurbishments. The old Hotel of Kings had been made more sumptuous than ever. Its restaurant, in decor and cuisine, was now one of the finest in the city and a rendezvous of fashion. One could take a magnificent new elevator to a roof garden, and for panoramic views of Paris, there were few to compare. Or, for that matter, from those guest rooms fronting on the Rue de Rivoli, one of which, room 329, Hart Berg had reserved for Wilbur. Stay in Paris and taste the pervasive charm, the freshness of beautiful summer nights. The sky dusted with stars is radiant, read an advertisement for the Maurice. The electricity shines through little lampshades. The flowers give out a fragrance. We are only a few steps from the Concorde, but one would think himself so far away, transported into a town of dreams. Wilbur wrote nothing of the roof terrace, or the magnificent crystal chandeliers in the main dining room, or the fancy livery worn by the elevator operator. Interestingly, in all he would write about his time in Paris, he never mentioned his plush accommodations. Probably he had no wish to incite envy at home, or to magnify concern over his being corrupted by high living. Except for the hotel stationery in which his letters were written, one would never have known where he was staying. Nor did he make mention of the women of Paris, or the fashions on parade, or the shops, the opera, the theater, or the French in general, or the American tourists, of whom there were a great many. What he did write about in the days that followed, apart from all he reported on his dealings with Berg, Gordley, and the French, were the great buildings and art treasures of Paris, revealing as he never had or had called to the extent of his interest in architecture and painting. Like so many seeing Paris for the first time, he could not get enough of it and covered more ground on foot than ever before. The 5 to 10 miles a day he walked on board ship would seem to have been only a warm-up. Whatever free time he had away from business, he was out and on his way. It was spring in Paris, the chestnut trees in bloom. From the Louvre to the Arc de Triomphe was nearly 2 miles of gardens and esplanades, with thousands of statues, he wrote. He climbed the 300 steps to the top of the Arc de Triomphe, walked the banks of the Seine to the Ile de la Cité, walked to the Opera, walked down the Rue de Rivoli 2 miles to the Place de la Bastille. On a Sunday morning, he hiked to the top of Montmartre, a distance of nearly 2 miles that included more than 300 steps. He loved seeing so much open space used to set off important buildings. Paris is the most prodigal of land for public purposes, he wrote in a long descriptive letter to Bishop Wright. There was much to be learned from the French about how to place public buildings. There is always an open space as big as a city square in front of each building. And in addition, there is nearly always a broad avenue leading directly to it, giving a view from a long distance. It is this, as much as the buildings and monuments themselves, that makes Paris such a magnificent city. If only a city like New York were arranged the same way. Even New York skyscrapers, like the Belmont and Knickerbocker hotels, if properly set, would be wonderful. He seems to have soaked up everything in view, and whatever he looked at closely. Some of the landmarks were a little shabby. Half the gilding was gone from the dome of Les Invalides, where Napoleon was buried. The same was true of the pedestal of the Egyptian obelisk in the Place Vendôme, and he was sorry to see so much of the statuary marred by black streaks. He spent considerable time at the Pantheon, which, he explained to Catherine, was not used as a church, but as commemoration of the great men of France. The dome, seen from inside, was not much, he decided. Too high in proportion to its diameter, like looking into an inverted well, but the interior was very grand. He took architecture seriously, thoughtfully, and made up his own mind, irrespective of whatever was said in his red Baedeker guidebook. Notre Dame was a disappointment. My imagination pictures things more vividly than my eyes. He thought the nave too narrow, the clear-story windows too high, the interior far too dark. The pillars are so heavy and close together that the double aisles on each side form no part of the room when you stand in the nave. How amazing it was, he wrote in another letter, to see thousands of people dining on the sidewalks up and down the avenues, sitting at tables outside restaurants, sipping wine and eating in the open air, right on the sidewalks. Often, as the time passed, he was himself dining handsomely as the guest of Wright Brothers. There was Boivin on the Avenue de Clichy in Montmartre, Henri's on the Rue Volney, and the famous Café Anglais, where Wilbur enjoyed lunch with both Berg and Mrs. Berg. He would fill his free time in Paris to advantage, and with the same level of intensity he brought to nearly everything, making the most of every waking hour in what, for all he knew, might be his one and only chance for such an opportunity. Of all that Paris offered, it was the Louvre that he kept going back to, again and again, spending hours there, and logging still more miles, walking the long galleries. His description of the paintings he saw could go on for pages. A sign, it would seem, of how much interest in art there was at home as well, and with Catherine in particular. He preferred the Rembrandts, Holbeins, and Van Dycks as a whole, better than the Rubenses, Titians, Raphaels, and Murillo. His disappointment in the Mona Lisa was as great as it had been in Notre Dame. I must confess that the pictures by celebrated masters that impressed me most were not the ones that are best known. He much preferred Leonardo's John the Baptist to the Mona Lisa. Above all, he was taken with the work of the 17th century Flemish master, Anthony Van Dyck. In a letter written after a full afternoon of the Louvre, he moved on to the collection of 19th century French masters, including Delacroix, Corot, Courbet, and Courbet. While I do not pretend to be much of a judge, I'm inclined to think that in 500 years, yet the collection will be recognized as some of the greatest work ever done. What appealed especially about Corot was the way he painted the sky. The sky was his source of light. Such keen interest as he had in art was not only remarkable from someone so committed to technical innovation, but a measure of truly exceptional capacity of mind. As weeks and months passed, Wilbur, of his own choice, visited the Louvre 15 or more times. What he did not report to those at home was the extent to which he was being scrutinized by the press and the stir he caused at public occasions. Any hope of anonymity was already gone. To a reporter from the Washington Post who stopped him in the lobby of the Hotel Maurice, Wilbur refused to say anything about his machine or his plans. When the subject turned to the difference between flying and going up in a balloon, Wilbur said he had yet to go up in a balloon, that it was entirely another thing from flying, which affects one with intoxication. After having once flown, it is almost impossible to turn to anything else. In mid-June, he went with Hartberg to see the balloon races at St. Cloud. Amid a particularly elegant crowd, in which were to be seen Gustave Eiffel and the American ambassador Jimmy White, Wilbur drew more attention than anyone. A reporter for the Paris Herald asked, "You are over here on pleasure, are you not, Mr. Wilbur?" To some extent, Wilbur said. I am enjoying myself splendidly and seeing all manner of new things. You like Paris? It is a marvelous city. Mr. Wright talked carefully, the reporter wrote. It was obvious that he feared to be caught in a trap concerning his remarkable machine and what he wants to do with it. At the end of each question, his clean-shaven face relapsed into a broad, sphinx-like smile. That this same American bicycle mechanic from Ohio was spending hours with the masterpieces of the Louvre was apparently not of interest to the press. The business sessions arranged by Berg had begun their first full day in Paris. Wilbur had been taken to meet an active patron of ballooning with a strong interest in aviation, Henri Deutsch de Lemert, whom Wilbur described for Orville as the Standard Oil King of France. There were sessions with Arnold Fordyce, Commandant Bonnel, and officials of the French government. Berg was a pretty slick hand, Wilbur told Orville, and things were going well. Berg was very practical, and Wilbur liked the way he was always at hand in explaining what was being said in French, and said so often at an extremely high speed. Berg could be depended upon to do his utmost. Besides, he was about as enthusiastic now as a man could be, and he really has a remarkable faculty for reaching people. The business talks often seemed endless, but thus far the prospects for an agreement looked encouraging. In general outline, the Wrights were to receive $350,000 for their flyer, once a public demonstration was made in France before any agreement was struck. The French insisted on seeing the plane and seeing it operate, which was clearly their right. The pot is beginning to boil pretty lively, Wilbur reported. But then one French faction tangled with another. Political intrigue intervened. Progress slowed. Not so many years before, Wilbur had decided he was unsuited for commercial pursuits. Now he found himself in the thick of extremely complex commercial dealings, playing for extremely high stakes, with highly experienced entrepreneurs, politicians, and bureaucrats, and in a language he neither spoke nor understood. The whole game, the players, the setting, the language, were all new to him. Yet he was more than holding his own and in good spirits, aware as he was of the derision to be found behind the scenes. That the War Ministry was being said to rank from bluffers like all Americans, worthless people, trying to sell to France an object of no value that even the Americans did not believe in. Alert, patient, closely attentive, Wilbur never rattled, as his father would say, never lost his confidence. He could be firm without being dictatorial, disagree without causing offense. Nor was there ever a doubt that when he spoke, he knew what he was talking about. Most importantly, he remained entirely himself, never straying from his direct, unpretentious way, and with good effect. If anything, his lack of French, his lack of sophistication, seemed to work to his advantage. He was indeed, as Hartberg had anticipated, a capital Exhibit A and more. That Wilbur neither drank or smoked or showed the least interest in women remained, of course, a puzzlement to the French. The whole while he was keeping those at home, and Orville in particular, fully abreast of all that was happening, by mail and by cable, often in lengthy detail, describing the various configurations of how they were to profit financially, depending on who put in what money. An experienced financial reporter could hardly have provided clearer coverage. For occasional relief, Hartberg would treat Wilbur to a pleasant chauffeur-driven drive with him and Mrs. Berg in their grand automobile through to Bois de Boulogne or out to Fontainebleau or Versailles. One Monday morning, while Wilbur was lying in bed, a hotel clerk knocked at the door to say a dirigible known as La Patrie was flying over Paris. La Patrie, as Wilbur knew, was the first airship ordered by the French army. He dressed at once and went up to the roof garden. La Patrie, the homeland, was a giant sausage-shaped gas bag with an open gondola for the crew hanging below. It passed over the Arc de Triomphe and almost directly over the reef at what Wilbur estimated to be 15 miles per hour. He judged it a very successful trial. But as he was shortly to write, the cost of such an airship was 10 times that of a flyer. The flyer moved at twice the speed. The flying machine was in its infancy, while the airship had reached its limit and must soon become a thing of the past. Still, the spectacle of an airship over Paris was a grand way to begin a day. Most mornings only meant more meetings. The primary question issue had become whether to sell to the French government or set up a commercial company with Henri Deutsch. The possibility of a contract with the government seemed all but certain until the French army insisted the flyer trial be conducted in winds too strong and demanded an exclusive agreement for 3 years, neither of which Wilbur would agree to. Then, for the first time, it became clear that Flint and Company was expecting a commission of 20%, not only on what they sold, as had been agreed on, but also on what the brothers retained. "Don't worry over Flint's commission," he told Orville. "We can hold them level." Next thing, Wilbur was informed confidentially that if he and Orville and their associates were to raise the price to the French government by $50,000, this sum could be distributed among persons who had the power to put the deal through. In other words, those in power would need to be bribed substantially. This Wilbur refused even to discuss. The longer the talk dragged on, the more obvious it became that little would ever be decided until a demonstration was staged, and Wilbur kept urging Orville to speed up progress at home. "I presume you will have everything packed and ready before this letter arrives," he wrote. "Be sure to bring everything needed in the way of spare parts. Bring Charlie Taylor along, of course, when you come. It will pay to have enough trustworthy assistance when we come to experiment." This was written on June 28. Wilbur had had no word from Orville for nearly a month. In a letter from Catherine dated June 30, he was to learn that things were not going at all well at home, that she and Orville felt left out of what was happening in Paris. Orv can't work any. Orv was quite uneasy. Orv was unsettled, really crazy to know what is going on, wroth over how things were being handled in Paris without him. Clearly, she was too. She and Orville had lost all patience with Flint and Company and questioned whether they could be trusted. She had had little or no experience with Jews, but having seen a photograph of Hart Berg, she wondered if he might be one. "I can't stand Berg's look," she wrote. "It has just dawned on me that the whole company is composed of Jews. Berg certainly looks it." A few days later, she let Wilbur know the situation at home had become even worse. She was nearing a crack-up, and it was largely his doing. "What on earth is happening to your letters?" Her letter became a storm of anger, blame, self-pity, and desperation far beyond her wrathy nature. She had had more than enough of the whole business. "We are all so nervous and worn out with the suspense that we can't any of us keep from being cross. Orv and I regularly fight every time we get together for 5 minutes. His poor daddy does nothing. He advises to be calm, Bessie, be calm. While he is so excited that he can't hear anything we say. She had never been so tired in all her life. I want to cry if anybody looks at me." Some of their letters to him were being returned because of the wrong address. "Why couldn't you tell us sooner that you weren't getting your mail? It makes us desperate to sit here and be perfectly helpless while they, Flint and Company, are working every scheme they can to get advantage of you. What business had they getting you into that French business? You could have done better there by yourselves. I despise the whole lot of them. Orv is so worried and excited and tired out that I feel some concern about him. He can't stand this forever. Neither can you, for that matter." The problem, Wilbur would later explain privately in a letter to his father, knowing the bishop would understand, was that Orville appeared to be in one of his peculiar spells and not really himself. The morning of July 17, from his room at the Maurice, Wilbur wrote a long reply to Catherine, setting straight for her and Orville the situation in Paris, how he was going about his part in it, his concern for them, how he had tried to spare them aggravation, and why they did not move. It was noticeably candid and entirely confident in tone, and was revealing of his own estimate of himself as almost anything Wilbur ever wrote. His message here, he was the one on the scene in Paris. He was in command, knew what he was about, knew the people with whom he was dealing, and there was no call for those at home to get worked up. In view of the fact that I have written alone 3 or 4 times as many letters home as I have received from all of you together, he began, it is a little amusing to read your continual complaints that you get so few from me. In the 2.5 months he had been away, he had received on average a letter a week from home, whereas he had been writing to them 3 to 4 times a week, except for a 10-day stretch when things were in such an unresolved state that there was nothing to report. He had felt from the start, he continued, that anything he wrote to Orville would unsettle him, but he felt Orville had a right to know what was going on. As for Flint and Company, he did not remind Catherine and Orville, as he could have, that it was Orville who had most wanted to get involved with them in the first place. I have done what I know he would have done if he had been here and understood all the facts. In such cases, the man at a distance only does harm by trying to give instructions which do not fit the case. Within days after reaching Europe, he had felt confident he could handle the situation. His only worry was whether Orville would be ready to follow as quickly as possible with the machine. It is not my custom to voice complaints, but this business of never being ready has been a nightmare to me for more than a year. As for Berg and Cordley, they had at first considered him merely sort of an exhibit. But their eyes have gradually opened, and now they realize that I see into situations deeper than they do, that my judgment is often more sound, and that I intend to run them rather than have them run me. Now, I control everything, and they give advice and assistance. In this role, they can be of great service to us, and I see no reason for breaking with them. He was very sorry that those at home were so worn down by excitement. He himself, he assured them, was feeling better than he had in several years. They must stop worrying. There was no need. In closing, he reported arrangements had been made by some Americans for him to go that afternoon on his first skiing flight. They took off from the Aero Club grounds in St. Cloud, eventually sailing into the clouds, converging about 3,000 feet out into bright sunshine and blue sky. It was higher in the sky by far than Wilbur had ever been, and the view was utterly spectacular. They were 50 miles from Paris by then, crossing open country. The alterations of rich brown, newly plowed soil, with green fields of grass with rings of different shades, and the light brown and yellow fields ready for harvest, made a wonderful picture, he wrote. He loved seeing the little towns with their red tile roofs and the white roads reaching off in every direction. They flew nearly 80 miles in just over 3 hours and landed in a wheat field about 10 miles west of Orléans. But beautiful as it had been, ballooning was not for him any more than it had been for Otto Lilienthal. Once on the ground, he had to hike to a nearby village, find somewhere to spend the night, and because of the prevailing winds, go back to where you started by a slow local train. What we are seeking is the means of free motion in the air, in any direction, Lilienthal had written. On the evening of the same day that Wilbur was heading back to Paris by train, Orville left Dayton on an overnight express for New York, also on his way to Paris. The Flyer 3 had been finished, packed, and shipped off to France to be stored in the customs house at Le Havre until needed. Orville, as Catherine said, had gone off looking pretty well fizzled out. He had also, as he discovered en route, forgotten to bring Wilbur's hotel address in Paris. 3. Early on a Sunday morning in late July, the brothers were reunited. Having enjoyed an uneventful crossing on the steamer Philadelphia, Orville succeeded in finding his way to the Maurice, where he discovered Wilbur looking better than he had in years. Following breakfast at the hotel, they went for a long walk together, talking the whole time. They lunched at the Café Alcazar on the Champs-Élysées, after which they spent most of a sultry afternoon sitting and talking in the park along that boulevard. And by all signs, they succeeded in clearing the air between them. The following day, they met with Hartberg and Frank Cordley in what Wilbur described as a rather warm heart-to-heart talk, meaning it was extremely heated. They took up the matter of patents, Wilbur making it clear from the start that Flint and Company was in no way entering into a partnership with them. We are and intend to be the sole owners of the patents, he said, according to his own notes on the conversation. They talked of expenses and of stock in the enterprise. The point is this, Wilbur told them. We do not intend you to own 20% of any stock. We intend to own the stock. You are the selling agents. And so it went back and forth, Berg making his case, Wilbur and Orville holding firm. From all Wilbur had reported and explained to him, and from his own judgment of Berg, and from the meeting, Orville had his suspicions absolved, his mind put to rest. He was ready to proceed with Wilbur and as Wilbur directed. Our friends F, Flint and Company, and B, Berg, are not in the bandit crew, Orville was glad to assure Catherine. Wilbur led Orville on a first stroll through the Louvre, and to celebrate Orville's arrival in Paris, Frank Cordley hosted an evening at the legendary and highly expensive Tour d'Argent by the Seine on the left bank, where a tableside preparation of duck canard au sang, the main course performed by the restaurant's celebrated owner chef, Frederic Dallaire, seems to have made a far greater impression on Orville than anything he had seen at the Louvre. Dallaire worked in a formal tailcoat, and with his flowing side whiskers and pince-nez eyeglasses, looked, as Orville would report to Catherine, more like a college